Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we have two tasks to perform. The first one would be to try and complete the lecture that I was giving, and in the second one, which was basically on consumer behavior research, we need to go into a little bit more depth on the instruments and the way you approach the research frame. And then at the end of the lecture, I will start launching into the concept we call segmentation. Why I'm going to keep these two things together? Because if you try and recall what we discussed, all customers to our mind are different. They behave differently, they have different ideas, they have different thought processes, they think about things differently. However, we as marketers still need to make sure that we can find a group which has got more or less similar behaviors and similar patterns and perceptions so that we can target them in the shape of offering our product. Now, keeping these 2 points in mind, therefore, the importance of marketing research or consumer behavior research is paramount in trying to figure out for the marketer which particular segment to target. Therefore, segmentation as a broad concept within the parameter of marketing strategy is critical. And then we will discuss various issues and the importance and why do we need to go into market segmentation, and then we'll build on that. Now, if you recall, we had discussed issues surrounding data that would be available to a marketer which can be used for analysis of the consumer behavior. And I mentioned to you that there are basically two types of data that we can collect. One is secondary data, which means that it is already available in the organization, in documents, in trends, which are normally available on the internet from the organization, and so on and so forth. But we need to be able to also collect primary data, which means it is for a particular specific purpose, and therefore we try and make sure that we have the objectives clearly laid down for the purposes of carrying out research. And in that, we were discussing the approaches or the paradigms that we have to come to this data collection procedures. Two of them that I had mentioned, one was quantitative research, the other was qualitative research. The difference we had suggested is basically in the shape of the data that you collect. In one case, it is more metric oriented. That means it is numerically oriented, and the qualitative data is basically more open-ended, more interpretive, more attuned to interpretation, but it makes it a little difficult to analyze that kind of a data. On the other side, the metric data or the quantifiable data, there are tools available, statistical tools, which you can apply. And I had suggested that there are a number of statistical softwares available to do that kind of job for you, which should be undertaken or would be undertaken in a different frame altogether. But we need to be very clear as to what kind of requirements are there in terms of collecting quantifiable data. Now, for that purpose, we have to come to a definite kind of a framework in which we will try and work out how to collect this data, what kind of instruments are there, what we call the research design. So we will be discussing that. Now, just briefly to go back onto it, we need to remember again that qualitative data collection is more interpretive. That means the expert who is going to carry out that kind of research has to know how to collate this information. And it is basically used when we are not very clear as to what the problem really is. And therefore, we tend to go into the depth and try to explore areas, which is how we do it. And the method we have already discussed is through in-depth, open-ended interviews or carrying out focus groups. But on the other side of the picture, we have what we call the quantitative data collection methods. And I had suggested to you that in that frame, we have broadly three areas. One is observation, the other was experiment, and the third was survey. I've given you some examples also regarding observation and regarding experiment. Today we will try and focus more into the area of survey. We should understand that surveys are normally done through questionnaire, and we can have two types of questionnaires. So we will work on the issues as to what the questionnaires should be like and what does it entail, these questionnaires. We had suggested that there are methods in which you can use these questionnaires to collect data, and in that we had the person interview type, where the person who's carrying out the research or the interviewer fills the form or the questionnaire for or from the customer regarding a purpose or a particular phenomena that is to be studied. Basically, it could be anything. It could be attitudes, it could be behaviors, perceptions, and so on and so forth. The second one that we discussed was telephonic surveys. That means somebody would go on the telephone, call the respondent, ask the questions, or the other method could be that you go to the mall, which is called the mall intercept, which means you go to the shops where the actual buying behavior is taking place and request the customer who has just done some purchase to fill up the form for you, or exactly you can do it for them, or the researcher can do it for them. Finally, we had the mail survey, and the mail survey was what we consider to be more cost effective, though the response rate seems to be less. Why? Because if you are across a person and you can motivate the person to help you fill the form, the likelihood is that it will be filled. But in a mail survey, when you send the document off, you have to depend on the person's own ability or his motivation to fill that form up. Therefore, what has been suggested by research, that this increase in response rate and motivation to give you the correct answer really depends on the type of questions asked, the layout or the format of the questionnaire, the sequence in the way the questions are asked, and all these things pulled together would improve not only to get you the correct answers, but also improve the response rate. So we will be discussing certain features about the questionnaires, because please remember that the most difficult thing that is more critical, I think, in terms of developing a questionnaire is the wording that the questionnaire must have. And you have to avoid certain pitfalls. That means you cannot just go and write a simple question, because there are implications behind it, and we discussed these two implications. And the implication was that we need to be very clear as to what we are going to ask. We need to be very clear as to what would be the required response because of validity and reliability issues. Now, validity and reliability, if you remember, we discussed very categorically that validity is whether the instrument will get you the kind of response that you are looking for. Whereas reliability, more or less, suggests that if you ask the same question from the same sample, you will get the same answer. So we have to be very, very careful regarding the issue of reliability. Now, the questionnaires, in a very short format, can be both disguised and undisguised questionnaire. Now, what does it mean to you to be able to say that these questions or these questionnaires are disguised, or these questions or questionnaire is undisguised? The difference between the two is that in one case, the first case where it is disguised, you do not tell the person the purpose of the research. Now, some people suggest that this could be unethical, but other people suggest that this type of methodology or this type of method of having a disguised questionnaire gives you better and truthful responses. The reason quoted is very simple. The reason quoted is that if the people know what is the purpose of the research, then people become inclined to give you that answer which they think you are looking for. So the responses from the respondents, if it is, let's say, undisguised, and that means the purpose is known, it would suggest that people will try and give you the answer that they believe that you are looking for. And I gave you an example at a point of time when I discussed the Xerox photocopying system, where people were asked how do they use photocopiers, and they try to give the laid out format for a manual. Now, therefore, if you hide the purpose, it is more likely that people will give you the right response. Now, that was the first part. The second part is the questionnaires can have questions which are two types. One is what we call the open-ended question, and the second is what we call the close-ended question. In the open-ended question, you ask a question in such a form that it gives the other person the ability and the flexibility to give any kind of answer that he thinks is right. So you give him space to write his view, his thought, his perception, his attitude, whatever that he wants to write in a space that you have created for him. For example, the question can be, what do you think about whatever you want to know? And you allow him to go in his own way and give you information. Now, the only trouble in this kind of system is that interpretation is more difficult. That means collecting or collating the information. Collating means कि उसको एक दूसरे से मरबूत करना जरा थोड़ा सा मुश्किल हो जाता है, because हर आदमी in his own language is giving you some information. Therefore, the researcher has to be very good in trying to interpret the information that is available in open-ended systems, and he has to find कि इसके बीच में जो कड़ी है, जो इन सारे जवाबों की कड़ी है, वो है क्या? This leads to interpretation. But on the other hand, if the question is close-ended, तो close-ended का फायदा ये है that when a person asks you a question, तो उसमें there is a numerical scale given, and the person has to respond to any one of the points along which he believes or his perceptions or his opinions coincide with that kind of a number. For example, you can say, how closely do you suggest your opinion is from among the following? And you give a question, you put the question on whatever the opinion is, and you range it between 1 to 7, 1 to 5. And if 1 is very close, then 5 will be very far away. That means if the person says it takes 1, which will mean that the person's opinion is very close to the opinion that you are asking him. But if he does not agree with you on that opinion, then he will score number 5. So with this method, what happens is that you are able to collect the numerically attuned data. The other benefit of this close-ended and using some kind of a scale is that you can either independently look at each response, and you can then analyze each response based on how many people were more close to your suggested opinion or how many against that opinion, so on and so forth. Or you can make an average or create a mean by which it would mean that everything can be collected together and averages can be taken out so that you get an idea about the overall population beliefs, attitudes, perception, and so on and so forth. Remember that I had already told you that in the case of qualitative research, the qualitative research is normally done when you are not sure about the problem, therefore you are exploring a problem. So in the quantitative area, what we are trying to do is that we are aware of the problem, but what we are doing is now trying to get the true picture of the phenomena that we are interested in. For example, we are interested in the attitude. How does it exist in the targeted population that we are concerned with? So the quantitative research is more focused on actually describing whatever the phenomena that we want to describe as it exists within a population, or if I would say the profile is developed within the population. Now, I told you that questionnaires, the most critical issue in the questionnaire is the language. Now, we will go over a few points regarding the language, and we should remember that whenever we are going to write the questions, we should avoid these following pitfalls. Now, the number one pitfall is that we should not ask a leading question. Leading question means that the answer is suggested within the question. For example, if I was to say, did you like this product? In a very simple form. Now, what I'm saying is that I'm already trying to suggest to the person that I'm asking you about liking the product. So it will create a biased answer. It could be better to ask, what do you think about the product in terms of whether you like it or dislike it? On the other side, the second difficult situation that we need to constantly avoid is to make sure that the language that we use is the language that is understood by a common person. We do not want to use certain words that are very specific to a particular professional, so that if we ask that kind of a question and he does not interpret the answer correctly, then what we could have had is, again, a biased answer. Now, the third point that we need to be very sure is that we should ask the question which the person will be able to answer. For example, if I was to ask the question, how many times did you visit, let's say, Macro in the last month, it will be very difficult for the person to recall each time that he has gone. Or Macro may be a little more easy to remember because you go there once a while. But if I was to ask, let's say, going to Anarkali or some other significant place where people go and visit, and I ask them, how many times have you been there during a month, I think it will become a little difficult. And particularly if you asked him for 3 months' time, it will become much more difficult. Now, the other issue that you need to be very careful about is that the person should be willing to answer a particular question. Now, how does that happen? If you ask something very personal, the person might be totally reluctant in answering that question. For example, in ethical research, in the research in ethics, we normally try, and on consumer ethics particularly, we normally have an issue. We find that people sometimes, there is a problem of shoplifting. Now, shoplifting is an issue which is quite understandable that it exists in our society, not only our society, but all over the world. So if I was to ask the question directly that, have you ever shoplifted? I assume that I will never get the right answer. What can be asked is, and on the other side, if you still want to get this kind of information, is to ask if you have observed anybody doing this. Now, the point is that this is more likely to get an answer, okay? Therefore, we have to be very careful in the question that we ask in terms of the ability of the person to answer this question. The one thing that we are very important that we need to be careful about is to totally avoid question which has got 2 points inside, which means if I was to ask that last time you visited Macro, did you get value and were you satisfied? Now, there are 2 points which are in the same question, and this is not a very good idea to do because the person might have got the value but might not have been satisfied. So if he says yes, he has a problem. So therefore, avoid 2 points or asking 2 questions in one single question. That is what you need to keep in mind. Having defined or described the issues that one faces while wording it, we now move on to what we call the research design. Now, research design requires 3 things. Number 1, the research instrument. Number 2, the sampling plan. And third, the method of data collection. How would you collect the data? And we have already discussed that, the data collection procedures. But in the design form, we now need to make sure that we understand the ways that the instrument or the questionnaire can collect the data. And that in that area, we will go to the concept of measures that we use. Now, in the case of measures, we normally use scales. Now, there are attitude scales, and sometimes we are also interested in customer satisfaction. So at this point of time, therefore, we will discuss the question of the research design. And the first part is the type of scale that you use. Now, in terms of scale, the number of scales that we find, there are typically 3 or 4 that you most probably would be interested in. And these are used for specific purposes. That has to be kept in mind. So for the purposes of these scales, what I will do is I will show each scale on the screen and then explain the frameworks that are required to be filled or the method of writing the scale. Now, I've told you that all these scales are attitude scales. For example, Likert scale requires agreement or disagreement with a statement that you have given. Now, for example, what we will be saying is, if you look at the screen, the question would be something like this. For each of the following statements, please record the number that best describes the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement. Now, number 1 would be strongly agree, 2 will be agree, and we will go to number 5, which is strongly disagree. Now, the question that is being asked is basically, if you look at it, it is fun to shop online, and there is a dash on it, which means that the person is required to fill the number to which he wants to write on this point. It could be if he agrees with totally, he will say strongly agree number 1. And if he thinks, no, he does not enjoy shopping online, then he will fill in 5 or any number which is linked with that system. Now, the second scale that we are interested in is the satisfaction measures. Now, again, in this, what we are interested in is to find out whether the customer is satisfied or not satisfied with whatever purchase behavior or consumer behavior that he's exhibited. In this, again, what we are saying is number 1 will be very satisfied, whereas number 5 will be very dissatisfied. And normally we find this, if you recall, we find these questions normally asked in restaurants after the service has been provided, before the bill is paid. People normally bring this kind of a questionnaire and asking, and that is considered to be satisfaction survey. The third one is we call the importance scales. Now, in importance scales, the idea is to be able to measure the importance of a particular concept in terms of its importance. Now, for example, I would be asking maybe whether we consider among the purchase behaviors, internet is a very important tool. Now, again, in this case, we have the 5 scale. The first one is extremely important, whereas number 5 is not at all important, which can also be asked, for example, if you want to ask whether the package is considered to be very important for the product. If it is very important or not important, the person will again be required to circle the same answer that he wants. The fourth is the differential scale, which is basically semantic differential scale. What does it mean, basically, semantic differential? Now, semantic differential means in the language, there are words which have got 2 extremes. For example, we can have a word called reliability and then no reliability, or bad or good. These are 2 frames, that is 2 extremes of the same idea. Now, semantic differentials normally try and give us a picture or a profile of how people rate features. For example, if there is a product that we want to know, for example, Toshiba, we may ask, do we believe Toshiba is reliable or not reliable? And in this case, again, the scale is divided into, let's say, 5 odd numbers or sometimes even numbers. And again, the person has to choose the specific number, which is what he believes about the concept. Now, in the 5th one, we have behavior intention scale. Now, behavior intention scales normally relates to the future behavior that the consumer would be exhibiting, which means we ask, would you be able to, or would you like to buy this product if a price is increased by, let's say, 5% or decreased by 5%? Now, this buyer intention sometimes is very critical for the marketer to understand, given that he has to have some kind of a strategy coming into position. Pricing, most probably, adding a new feature. And what you are interested in is trying to figure out whether, based on these features or these variables that you have added or subtracted, would the customer still be willing to buy into the future? So basically, buyer intention scales are meant to understand the future buying behavior. And again, let me say what the question could be. The question would be, how likely are you to continue using A or B or C product for the next 6 months, for example? Now, the first choice is definitely will continue. Second is probably will continue. Third is might or might not continue. And the fourth is probably will not continue. And the fifth is definitely will not continue. After this, there is one more scale that we are interested in, and that is called rank order scale. Now, rank order scale actually helps you to complete the picture of the person or the concept or the phenomena that we are interested in terms of how do you rank various products or various advertisements or various, whatever is the choice that you are looking for. And the question normally is used, for example, given the following prices or the following quality, which of the product will you like to buy number one? And then you say which will be the one that you buy number two, number three, number four, number five. You give the various products and you ask the consumer to actually put the numbers in front of the choices that they have in terms of prioritizing their frameworks. I mean, whatever they want to buy and how they prioritize their behavior in terms of the products or features or whatever you want. Now, therefore, this more or less covers the kind of scales that we normally use. And I've already discussed with you the kind of language that you use. And I've already shown you certain questions that are used, and you should be able to pay more attention to these. Now we come into the third part of it, and as that is, where do you collect this data from? Now, this is what we call the sampling design, or the sampling design includes these following frameworks. Who do you ask this question from? How many people would you be using to get these answers? So what will be the first question is what we call the sampling unit. So you want to find it from one person, and he or she becomes that sampling unit. So you need to define the sampling unit very correctly. Number two is how many? Would you ask 50 people, 100 people? That requires the kind of question that is responded to by the sample size. And the third is, how do you actually select these people? So the third part in the sampling area or the sampling design is, how do you carry out the selection of the sample? Now, first, before we go into the details, let's ask ourselves, why do we want to have a sample? To define why do we want to have a sample, we must also look at what is the population of interest. Now, basically, when a marketer wants to sell a product or wants to find an opinion, the market definition is quite vast. There may probably be hundreds and thousands of buyers of the same product or buyers who the marketer is interested in. Therefore, the researcher can ask the whole population the same question. But like I said, it will become a little difficult. You cannot go to every person and ask the same question. So what we do is that we try and find a group of people or group of the unit, sampling unit, which totally represents the population. The idea comes from, and let me tell you that normally we think about how reliable is this instrument and how valid is the research that we have undertaken. Then one of the major concepts within that is the sampling frame. The issue is that if you have selected the correct sampling frame from which you will choose the actual people, then this sampling frame must represent the overall population. The idea is that what we are trying to do is to measure that one concept, measure that one phenomena, measure the one thought or of interest from among the total population. But how do we do it? We use the sample to represent the population. If we can accurately target these the units properly, then whatever the answer given by this sampling unit, we would assume would represent the total attitude or the total perception of the overall population. Please remember that the idea is that we need to generalize our research, our findings on a particular population. Now, generalizing a population or generalizing the idea over a population, we would like to have a sample which will be exactly representative of the population. Therefore, the most important thing before we can actually draw out a sample, we need to define the population on which we want to generalize the research. In doing that, what we need to do is to be able to profile the population in a very in-depth manner, so that when we want to select who would be part of that sample or the research, we are very clear that we are not making a mistake. So we are actually asking a question from the person who is representing it. I'll give you an example here, which was a mistake made, and later on it was considered that it was a mistake. Long time back, there was elections take place in America, and people try and predict who will win, just like it happened in the present time. It was considered that Obama will win, and in doing that, people from all over America were not asked the same question. However, the census, the people who do the polls, they checked from a limited number of people to ask whether who will win. Obama will win or McCain will win, and ultimately it was concluded that Obama will win, and obviously he did win. But this was done through a sample. Now, long time back, again, at the beginning of the 20th century, that is somewhere around 1930, a similar research was done by the same poll company, which tried to figure out who will be the president at that point of time. The only thing was that they asked the question from those people who actually owned telephones at that point of time, because it was simple to reach them on the telephone. So they got an answer, but unfortunately, the person who they predicted would win never won the election. It was the other person who won. So later on, it was discovered that the sample that was chosen was based on the ownership of telephones. So the voting was done by people who did not own even telephones. But like I said, the sample was that the question was asked from people who did own telephones. And this gave a wrong research findings. And that is why we say, and remember that at that point of time, close to about, questions were asked from about 70,000 people. Now, 70,000 is a very large number. I'm not going to quote the exact number, but it was approximately around that range. But that was a very large number. So it was assumed that this census will be, this research would be accurate. However, it was not. So we come to 2 points here. Number one is the sample size. What should be the sample size? Number two is the representation of the population by the sample. According to research, it is suggested that if the sample represents the population accurately, then the likelihood is that the error between the findings in the sample and the actual position in the population will be very small and can be ignored. So therefore, the idea is that when you are going to select a sample, which is obviously the selection of the sample frame, then it should be defined in such a manner that it will represent the population very, very accurately. Let's take an example here. For example, you want to do research among students. If you were to do research among students which you think are of the age group between 18 and 25 and studying at the bachelor's level, then if you only went and asked the question from people who are studying business, because there are limited business schools and you can approach these people in a very simplistic manner, then your findings are going to be wrong, because they are not going to be related to all the bachelor students, but only specifically to the bachelor students who are studying the business. To be able to collect information from or for the purposes of generalizing on all graduates, then you must have the ability to select the sampling frame from all the students who are studying in the graduate program. Having said this, we now must look at how do we select the sample from the defined sampling frame. Now, to be able to do that, we have two methodologies. One method is what we call the random sampling method, and the second one is the non-random sampling method. Now, first of all, what's the difference between the two? And obviously, what are the outcomes of these two methods? It is assumed that if you have chosen the sample totally randomly, the idea is that every unit, I've already defined the sampling unit, every unit in the sample has the opportunity or the probability to be included in the sample. And that is what is random sampling. The logic is that if you ask questions randomly from the sample population, then you are most likely to get a very generalized view in which you are interested in. However, if you go to non-random sampling, then what will happen is that you will most probably be inclined towards a particular group of people, which will bias the results. Now, what is the issue here is that if you look at the board, I'll show you what is the basic formula that we want to have in terms of regression. Now, we have y. Y is the dependent variable which we want to study, and x is the independent variable. And the formula that we must have studied in our basic algebra course is y is equal to a plus bx plus e. Now, what is this e? E is this error term, which actually means that the impact that is being brought by the independent variable, which is x, on the dependent variable, which is y, is not exact in the sense that there could be some other factors which are operating, which is captured by the term e. Now, what is of our interest as researchers is to reduce the impact of this error term e. Now, one method of reducing this error term e is that if we can reduce the biasness or the noise that is created in this relationship between the x and the y. To do that, we need to make sure that this error, which is e, is only related to what we call the sampling error. Now, sampling error means that whatever is the difference, if we keep repeating, let's say if we keep repeating this analysis and we keep collecting data on the same frame and we keep analyzing it, then this change that is taking place in terms of y based on the term x is going to be related to the change in the type of sample that you have collected, which means that it is random error coming through, which means it is not a systemic error or systematic error, which means it is coming in because you are taking information from the sample, but from different people within the sample. Now, this is why we want to make sure that we have error term to be reduced, and we make sure that there is less biasness. Obviously, we cannot eliminate the biasness totally, but we want to reduce the biasness. On the other hand, if you look at it, if we have a non-random sample, then number one, mathematically, we cannot measure the sampling error, which means we will never know whether this error that is coming in repeatedly, is it because of the randomness of the sample selection, or is it coming out because of a bias? And that is why we want to make sure that we select the random sampling. However, let me put it this way, that there are certain types of researches which may not permit, in terms of time, expenses, cost, whatever, for you to go into a totally randomly selected sample. But we need to be very clear that the best results, particularly in quantitative analysis, will come when the sample is random. Now, again, there is a direct relationship between the randomness of the sample and the size of the sample. Now, if the sample selection is totally random, because like we said, we are trying to represent the population, then if the selection is random, we believe that it will represent exactly the population. However, in terms of non-random sample, to reduce this difference between the sample finding and the population's actual behaviors, we need to increase the sample size. For example, if you are interested in getting information about 100 people, then if we just collected the information from 10, but the sample is totally random, we believe that it will be quite accurate in representing the 100. On the other hand, if we are going to go for a non-random sample, the representation of the population must be determined by increasing the size of the sample, which means, let's say, if we have randomly selected and we only choose 10 of them, then it is possible, non-randomly selected, if we have chosen only 10, it is likelihood that we are going to have a biased representation. But to improve on that, we might like to go to 50, 60. Now, if we go to 60, then the likelihood of the error between the information that is generated out of the 60 and the information that is available or sitting in the 100 will be minimal, that the difference will be minimal. Therefore, sample size is directly related to also the randomness of the selection procedures. How do you do it? Now to the various ways of random sampling first, and then we will go to the non-random sampling. Simple random sample or selection method is when every unit has a chance of being included in the sample of the question. There are many methods of random sampling. Many are there, which includes using odd systems, that is, you put the numbers into a box and shake the box and then take out a number, and the number is randomly selected and you do not have a bias. This is a very simple example of a simple random sample. The second method is, which is called a systematic random sampling method. And in that, what you do is, let's say you have a list of 1,000 people and you select the first person or the first unit or sample unit in terms of using the same method that I've given you. So you, let's say, collect number 9. And then you decide that every 6th person will be included in the sample. Now, this is what we call systematic random sampling method, which means the first choice is done totally random, and then systematically you take a number and you go and proceed through that whole system. The third method is what we call clustering system. Now, cluster random sampling is that, for example, we want to sample the population in Lahore. What we can do is we can break down this whole population of Lahore into areas, blocks, like say Johor town, then we might have Gulberg, and we might have cantonment, and so on and so forth. And then, since we have clustered the various areas in terms of blocks, we select from each block the sample in the random manner in which I've already told you. For example, we can do it by the number of, or given the houses a particular number, and then choose the house number randomly for each area. So we get clusters of this sample based on certain frame. Final method that we have is what we call stratified sampling. Now, what happens is, and a good example again is, it's very similar to cluster sampling, but stratified is when we create stratas of the population of interest and then pick samples from there. Let's say we want to study students. in a university. Let's take a simple example, and we want to study students in a university, and we know that students are enrolled, let's say, in the intermediate, in the undergraduate program, then in the graduate program, and in the PhD program or the postgraduate program. What we do is that we identify the various strata. So there is a strata which is basically only the intermediate students. Second strata is the undergraduates. The third strata is the graduates, and the final is the postgraduate. Then what we do is we look at the number of people in the intermediate strata and decide that we will select 10% of the intermediate. We decide that we will select 10% of the undergraduate and 10% of the total population in the graduate and then the postgraduate. And within these, then we select them randomly. So we get a list of people in the intermediate level and make our choice based on the frames that I've already told you in terms of whether you use the random, simple random sample or systematic. Now, once we are clear on these four methodologies we have on random sampling, we now look at the areas of non-random sampling. Now, there are three major methods available to us in terms of non-random sampling. One is called convenience sampling. What is basically convenience sample? And that means basically that we choose a sample which we can approach easily. It is on our or the researcher's own convenience that he approaches that group of people who he believes fall within the population frame, who represent it, but the choice of the individuals are based on the convenience of the researcher. And that is why I said that this may create a bias, because the person who is approaching the people who he knows might have similar behaviors and similar attitudes. So their obviously response would be more similar in that framework. The second one is called judgmental sampling. Now, again, we have to be very careful. Judgmental sampling is a little tricky in the sense that we need to make a judgment about the sample being representative of a population. Who can make a good judgment? It has to be an expert who can say, yes, that this population is represented by this sample. So judgmental sample is basically choosing a sample which, in the opinion of the expert, is accurately representing the population. The final one is called the quota sampling. Now, quota sampling is very similar in terms of the cluster or the stratified sampling, but the only difference is that in quota sampling, once you have determined the number of people that you will choose from various stratas or various clusters, what you do is that you select them again on a non-random base. Okay? So when you select them on the non-random base, again, we have what we call quotas given to a particular strata, particular cluster, and the choice is non-randomly selected. Okay? Today, I had planned to move into the lecture on segmentation, but since we have taken very in-depth view of the area of research, and I hope that it has been able to clear a lot of areas for you, we will take up the segmentation section in the next class. So before we finish, I'd like to just touch upon the ethical issues that we face while we are carrying out this research. The ethical issues are generally very simple to understand, but we need to be very careful when we are collecting data. Now, one of the most important and significant things in the ethical issue is that the data that you collect is very personal, and therefore, the person you are asking the question, we call them respondents, they must be assured that this information that you collect will not be used for any other purpose except for the purpose of the research that you are conducting. Now, this is very, very important. Number two, there should not be any misrepresentation from the interviewer to the respondent. I'll just give you a very simple example. There are times that people have done it, and I think that is unethical to do, and that is that you make a call, or some interviewer makes a call to the likely respondent and tells him to induce him to give the answer, and he tells him it will take only 10 minutes to do so, that he will be taking only 10 minutes. But then what he goes and does is that he carries on the questioning and the research for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Now, this is not justified. So therefore, there are certain basic issues which are incorporated or which should we be aware of in terms of ethics in research framework. Now, to tie up this day's session, we have discussed basically the instruments and the language that is required to be used and what we should avoid doing while we are framing the question. Second area that we looked in very depth is the kind of scales and measurement scales that we have, and what are the basic, the features of these scales, and how and where can we use these scales. Finally, before we finish, and I told you that in the next class, we will go into the area of segmentation, which is critical, and you will understand the linkage between research as well as segmentation procedures and the concept as it fits into the marketing strategy. Okay, thank you very much.